Hello YouTube! Today I'm going to take you on a journey to discover Viking lifting wisdom. For those of you who don't know who Vikings were, they are essentially an ethnic group that originated from Scandinavia, that from the late 8th to the late 11th century raided, traded, and settled throughout Europe. So it's been more than 1,000 years. And yet, Vikings are as relevant today as they used to be, especially in lifting culture. The Viking imagery is quite present. You can see it on t-shirts, but if you go to a hardcore gym, you might even find Viking emblems on the walls, or you might find lifters who have Viking tattoos. That is quite common. And the reason for that is simple. It's because to this day, when you think about masculinity and power, you think back to Vikings almost immediately. In our current imagination, we see them as the representation of the perfect warrior. This is how much of an impact that these men had on history. They were such strong fighters that to this day, if you ask someone, hey, tell me a time where men were tough, people will immediately point out to Vikings. And this is the reason why a ton of modern men also like to think of themselves as descendants of the Vikings because it's an identity that they like. It makes them feel better about themselves, which is why I personally know guys, dudes who lived, who have no ties whatsoever with Scandinavia, but they still like to think of themselves as Vikings. They embrace their ideology and their spirituality. All of which, for the same reason I just explained, it's because the Vikings were very masculine. And in an age where masculinity is almost dead, we like to think back to figures of the past that represent what we wish we could be for inspiration and for hope. This is what the series is about. So today, we are going to explore why exactly the Vikings were seen as strength incarnate and all of the things that surround it, because we will also get to explore the more cryptic and mysterious parts of Viking identity and culture that exists beyond the surface of the brutish and strong warrior, which I personally believe is just as interesting, if not more. So first off, what exactly makes Viking culture such a masculine culture? Well, it's because they had what is known as a warrior culture, meaning that in their societies, only the strong were valued, and therefore your combat prowess as a male was a vital attribute to possess in order to be successful. If you were weak, you couldn't defend yourself or your family, and you did not possess weapons to use, you were going to rank lower on the totem pole in the hierarchy of the country, of the village where you lived. It was inevitable. And this correlates with the way of life, of course. If strength is highly valued, this also means that warriors are going to be high status and that people are going to want to become high status, and therefore every man is going to strive to be as strong as possible. So when they were not farming on their lands, because Vikings were also farmers, the thing that they liked doing the most and what made them famous is their discoveries. They like to go out there and explore the world. Of course, it wasn't as nice as to just be like a Japanese tourist with like a camera on your belt and just take pictures of trees, right? They went out there to conquer. Their goal was to create new territories for them to settle. And if they were just not looking for any new land, what they did instead is they simply raided other people, they took all of their riches, and they brought them back home. This is why Viking culture is still very present in our imagination. It's because they sort of forced it upon us. The image of the Viking was an image of fear, and it's interesting that with the years it turned into something different. Now we admire that. We admire the strength that they had. A strength that, again, allowed them to create settlements. For example, Iceland. Iceland was completely inhabited until the Vikings decided to settle it. And I think it says a lot about who they were as people that they chose Iceland, of all places. Like, colonizing Hawaii makes sense. It's nice, the sun, there's pretty girls. Iceland, there was nothing. It was a rock in the middle of the ocean with a few people, maybe, and sheep. That's it. It's cold as fuck. Why would you want to settle that place? Well, they did. And if you go back to Iceland to this day, look at the people who live there. You have to be very strong to live in Iceland. So, still, the heritage of the Viking leads us to strength. A lot of strong men are also of Icelandic descent. Compared to the percent of the population they represent, it is insane how many champions were actually from Icelandic descent themselves. And that's because they come from a lineage of very strong men who are constantly looking to expand their family's influence and power. It was the goal of a Viking in life to expand, which also explains why you have people in France, for example, who are not Scandinavians at all, and yet they like to look up to Vikings. Same in America. The Viking imagery, again, is very attractive to young men because they came from an aggressive culture of power-seeking men, whereas we live in a passive-aggressive culture. And I would like to point out the fact that apparently when you have a warrior culture, you create strong men, and when you have a weak culture, what you create is culture warriors. So instead of having guys who fight to gain access to wealth or resources, instead you have dudes who engage in bickering on the internet about politics or about pop culture. That is the difference. That is why many men wish to recall back the imagery and the ideals of the Vikings, is because they do not want to be modern men. They want to be able to actually call themselves men. So this is the collective imagination. Now, this is mostly what we make of it, right? But is it true? Were Vikings actually like this? Were they the chads that we depict in our heads? Well, when you think about a Viking right now, you're most likely going to think about a guy who's very tall, most likely with a beard, very muscular, and fair, so most likely blonde with blue eyes. And for the last point, you are not incorrect. If we look at what most studies show, it shows that in West Scandinavia, most Vikings were red-haired. And in northern Scandinavia, they were mostly blonde. So they were actually very fair people. But for the rest, it's a little bit more dubious, because when it comes to things like, for example, their height, we know for a fact that people in Scandinavia back then were not that tall. Looks to me like their stature was greatly embellished because we want them to be bigger and taller than they actually were. In terms of stature, the average Viking man was between 5'6" and 5'8", while the average woman was between 5'3" and 5'5". So that's roughly in correlation with what we are today. Some historians even go as far as to say that they were much shorter than we are today on average. However, this is only true for certain skeletons found in certain burial sites. When it comes to the sites that contain the remains of warriors, the remains often included individuals that ranged from 6 feet to 6'4". And these are the ones that people think about when they think about the Vikings, the 6'4" monsters that would invade other people's land. So how give? Why do we have such different sets of data? Well, it's for a very simple reason. It's selection bias. You see, when you're going to send warriors to a different country, you're going to pick the fittest and the strongest. You're not going to send your weaklings. It's the same here. It would be the equivalent of someone in, I don't know, Afghanistan seeing American soldiers and saying, okay, this is the representation of the average man back in America. No, of course not. The soldier is much fitter. In America, the guy would be a fat ass. It is the exact same here. The Vikings only sent the bigger and stronger, and therefore these were the warriors of the group, and when you look at their height, yes, they were much taller than the average man. But it's because they were taller they became warrior and not the other way around. Meanwhile, the small and sickly stayed at home. You have to understand that in Viking culture, going to fight was a duty, but it was also a privilege. You could not go fight if you were weak. And therefore, of course, again, it's only normal that by selection bias, you would end up with warriors that were the tallest of the group, the biggest of the group. Now, when it comes to bodies, it's a bit different because we just spoke about height. And I don't want you to think that only the tall Vikings could fight. It's not true. You had some Vikings of much smaller stature that were also legendary warriors. And what they had in common with the tall ones is the fact that they were extremely muscular. We have writings that show that, regardless of their height, they were much bigger than the average male, the average European male. And that was mostly due to their diet. if you look at what they ate back then, most of what they consumed was dairy, meaning that they had milk and they would eat and drink milk in high quantities. And they did that because it allowed them to save on livestock. Instead of killing the livestock to be able to eat meat and get protein and fat from it, they would just drink the milk. This is why to this day, if you are from Scandinavian descent, you most likely can handle milk very, very well because it is in your DNA. Your ancestors stuffed their face with that liquid. And this diet, along with very heavy physical activity, built very strong and resilient bodies. And that's a very interesting thing about Vikings too. That their strong bodies did not come from lifting weights. They would lift stones, and we're going to get back to that, but most of their frame was built off of physical labor that pertained to their daily activities, meaning that every single male had to go through that, and therefore every single male was more or less ripped and jacked. So things that they do, for example, was farming. Vikings were mostly farming, and what you do when you farm is you do farmer's carry, for example. You lift heavy stuff and you move it from point A to point B. That builds you up. You also toss things, A tosses. You utilize every muscle in the body. This is why to this day, you have people who are farmer strong. They don't lift weights, but they are big and they are extremely powerful. Why? Because physical activity builds muscle, right? The gym is not a magical place where hypertrophy occurs. Hypertrophy occurs in every single environment. It's just that the gym and resistance training is the best way, the most optimal way, quote unquote, to build muscle. What they also did was rowing. They were Vikings. So the boats that they had, you had to row these boats. The wind was not enough to move them for the most part. And rowing builds the entire body. They also did shipbuilding because you have to build the ships, and to build a ship you have to cut the trees, and then you have to cut the tree that you just cut, so as to be able to make it into edible, quote-unquote, wood, so as to be able to construct a drakkar, as we say in French, which also takes a lot of physical strength. Anyone who has ever chopped wood in their life knows that it builds the upper back to a tremendous extent. So just with these three things, we have enough to build a complete physique. If you train like this, you would have massive arms, you would have massive backs, and massive legs. You have a full body workout right there. Now do that every single day of your life with a protein-heavy diet, with a ton of calories, easy calories that anyone has access to, and you understand why, compared to the rest of the population, they were much bigger. They were even described by Arabs as perfect physical specimens, and were even said to be as tall as palm trees. Now, I don't know how tall Arabs were back then, but that's high praise. Just understand that, of course, the Arabs of the time could only come into contact with the strongest of Vikings who had the energy and power to travel all the way to Muslim land and then conduct business because, and this is a point I'm going to insist on later on, Vikings were not just killing people when they traveled or raided, they were also merchants. They would trade with other people. And they were apparently obsessed with les dinars. Les dinars is the money that Muslims used at the time. They really liked them. So they would buy them. They would also buy jewelry made by Muslim craftsmen. They quite enjoyed it. They liked their stars. And there's even stories of Vikings converting to Islam, which is not surprising. We'll get to understand that later, but their two religions and cults are extremely close together because what they value above all is strength. I made a video about Islam, actually, if you're interested in the topic, Islamic lifting wisdom, it's in the description. But we'll get back to Muslims because Muslims and Vikings actually came in contact much more than you think. And that is because, as I said, Muslims respect strength. If there is something I realized talking to Muslims in my life, and it's what I love the most about them, is the fact that regardless of who you are and who you believe in, as long as you are strong, they will respect you. I could even find writings of Muslims who praised crusaders. The very people that we were fighting against, they would write pamphlets about the fact that they were big, they were strong, and respectable men because of that. They also quite like when men are very vital, so they would be a little bit obsessed by Europeans who could eat a lot. And there are stories of Muslims looking at Frenchmen who would stuff their face with a ton of food, and they would be quite impressed by that. All of which I will eventually get to talk to you about. But that also goes to show that the Vikings were not just strong in our imagination. We didn't just make it up, right? It came from somewhere. These people were actually monsters, and they had to be, because if you are going to be a successful Viking, you had to fight. And to fight like a Viking, you had to, one, wear no armor, or almost no armor, and two, you had to carry axes. If you look at the history of European people, the sword was the superior weapon to fight in close quarters if you were not going to use a spear. And one of the last few people who used axes to fight in a melee were Vikings. And the reason why they were successful with that is because they possessed the strength to actually rush into battles with their axes. Now, if you look at the strategy of Vikings, for the most part, they were not the best organized. And that's for a reason. They did not want to fight army versus army because they would lose their advantage, since their fighting style was highly individual. So if you put people in front of them who are organized, they're going to be in trouble. And this is why their raids were mostly by surprise. They would arrive by surprise and they would raid towns before people could actually prepare for that. And this is actually quite smart, because their goal was not necessarily to kill as many people as possible. If they could steal the treasure of the town and leave, they would. Which is why also they actually played off of fear a ton. Their reputation they have to this day is not necessarily entirely fabrication, but it's greatly exaggerated, and Vikings were proud of that. They liked to inspire fear, because if people fear you, they don't fight, and if they don't fight, you are less likely to lose your soldiers in battle. So this is actually something that the Vikings encouraged. And I also find out that most of the writings we have about the Vikings at the time were from the church, for the simple reason that mostly monks were able to write, and therefore to write history and to create the chronicles of the past. And the issue is that the Vikings tended to target monasteries, not because they hated the church, but because they quickly understood that if you go to a town, most likely there are two places where there's going to be riches: the castle, that is highly protected and tough to invade, and the monastery. And the monastery is easy to breach because the monks are not going to fight back and they have fewer protections. So they would constantly raid monasteries, and I think that it made the church extremely mad. So when they wrote about them, they were not very nice. Which, as I said, actually helped the Vikings. They were quite happy about that. But it would be untrue to say that Vikings were not fearsome. Of course, they were very strong warriors. They had absolutely no pity for the people they would kill. Although I would like to point out that because they practiced slavery, they were much more likely to capture you alive than to kill you. But they did possess a very fearsome corpse known as the Berserkers. And here I can already hear all of the Berserk fans scream, yes, this is where it comes from. The Berserkers were an elite corps of men who wore bearskins and worshipped Odin, and they could apparently enter a form of battle fever to turn into human beasts. So if you have read Berserk, this is what happens to Guts. He gets into a trance and he just turns into a monster. If you look at Wild from Berserk, the Apostle, and you look at his troop, they are also Berserkers, and you will also have noticed that they were bearskin as well. And what I found interesting about that is that historians think, we're not sure, but they think, that Berserkers were the reason why the myth of the werewolf was so present in Europe. People were actually afraid of werewolves. They thought it existed back then. And this might be the reason. Because if you're just minding your own business and you look up and you see a man screaming at the moon, wearing a bearskin and rushing at you and killing you and eating your corpse, you're going to think that this is a wolf. You're going to think this is actually a beast in human form. So they were actually so fearsome, these men, that they created an entire myth around their very presence. And these were actually bad guys. Like, this is not exaggerated. They would murder whoever, children, women, it did not matter. And they would actually engage in rape. Now, you could tell me that this is a little bit strange. I'm being precise about that and telling you that they raped and not the Vikings. But actually, we have very few writing and proof of Vikings raping women. We're going to get back to that. But apparently, this was not really their motto. Maybe they found it to be dishonorable. They did take women to turn them into slaves, but the raping was mostly done by the Berserkers. And interestingly enough, even in Viking sagas and stories, the Berserkers are seen as villains. So even within their own culture, they understood that this was not proper behavior, but because these people are just creating fear in the hearts of the opponents, they would gladly use them, utilize them. For the most part, in Viking society, berserkers were not highly respected. They were not high-ranking warriors. They were usually rejects of society, and they usually served as bodyguards for more well-respected warriors, which again correlates with what happened in the story Berserk. Because the people who are part of Wild's troop also rape women, kill children, and they are all convicts. They all committed crimes in the past. But as for the other Vikings, the other soldiers, we find that they were surprisingly charming people, also as reported by Muslim merchants. One, for example, writes that Vikings are generous to each other. They honor their guests and they treat well those who seek refuge amongst them. They do not allow anyone to annoy or harm these. So hospitable people with a very high code of honor, they did not allow people that they took care of being harmed, which tends to be contrary to popular belief, because of course the Vikings wanted to be seen as rough and tough so that people wouldn't mess with them. Because of course, if you invade other people's countries, and on top of that you have the image of people who are very dangerous, no one is going to want to invade your country. So now you're safe on both fronts. It's actually quite genius. But contrary to popular belief, it was not the crux and the entirety of their character. And one thing that in your imagination you might perceive as being true towards Vikings, which is their filthiness, is actually also part of that myth, because writings prove that they were also extremely clean. The men especially were known for bathing, braiding their hair, and they smelled good. And then this leads us to my favorite part of the entire story, because apparently that fact in particular really annoyed European men, because they saw Vikings as unfair competition. And we can only understand why. Can you imagine having to compete for women with a guy who is much taller than you, because he's essentially the Chad of his entire culture, blue hair, blonde eyes, smells good, is muscular, and you're like a 5'4" peasant that eats carrot for breakfast and has no teeth? I also wouldn't be super keen to welcoming these people in, and I would also complain. Now, when it comes to women, we know that Vikings stole women, right? They came in and they stole people, and women sold at a high price as slaves, so they took them. It would be a lie to say they did not do that, because they were doing that for money and resources. We also know that they took some as wives against their will. They would just grab one and take them home, and there it is, you are my wife now. You don't really have a choice. You're not going to jump onto the next boat to just go back home. It simply doesn't work like that. Which is why, by the way, if you look at DNA tests throughout Europe, a ton of people are of Scandinavian descent by a very small percent, because one of their very, very remote ancestors was a Viking, which is to the point that actually half of Icelandic women can claim Gaelic heritage. Not Scandinavian, Gaelic. Why? Well, because the Vikings loved raiding Ireland, and they absolutely loved Irish girls as well. They found them very attractive according to the writings. And what they did essentially is that they would take girls from Ireland, and they would actually then take their boat up to Iceland and settle the place with a brand new woman. So that's half of Icelandic population. That is extremely high. But these are for the cases where we can pretty much surmise that the woman was not willing. There are also cases where apparently girls would willingly follow Vikings, meaning that Vikings would raid a place, or most likely just trade with people, and a few of the women were so taken by their looks that they would just live with them. They would just take the pick of the leader and decide, all right, I would rather go home with that guy. Even though they didn't know really where the guy was going, they couldn't speak the same language, and they still made that choice. And it was to the point that, again, people started to complain. Men of Europe started to complain. And we have one such complaint in the Chronicle of John of Wallingford from the 13th century, where it is reported that the Danes made themselves too acceptable to English women by their elegant manners and their care of their person. They combed their hair daily, took baths every Saturday, and improved the beauty of their bodies with many such trifles, by which means they undermined the chastity of wives. So it's essentially an English peasant from the 10th century or something that was just minding his own business in the field. A Viking walks by and his wife is like, you know what, John? I'm going to follow him because he smells good. He actually has teeth again and he's pretty. I want kids with that guy. And the guy was just wifeless at this point. And he would go to his lord and be like, what the fuck is this bullshit? Like, screw these people, like, kick them out of the country. What the fuck is this? Of course, you would be upset. So this is what Vikings were up to apparently. When they were not killing you on the battlefield, they would steal your wife. Absolute chads, I tell you that. And this, again, made them widely unpopular amongst people of Europe. But it's not the only thing that differed between other Europeans or Arabs, for example, and Vikings. We also have to point out at a wide difference in customs and spirituality, because the Vikings were pagans, as you might know, and they did things differently. For example, in the way they buried their dead. A Viking was quoted to say, "You Arabs, you are a lot of fools, because you purposefully take your nearest and dearest and those whom you hold in higher esteem and put them in the ground, while they are eaten by vermin and worms. We, on the other hand, cremate them there and then, so that they enter the garden on the spot." So Vikings didn't bury their dead, they burnt them. And they did that because they believed that the smoke would carry the soul to the afterlife. That's an interesting belief. And it shows the soul of these people, those people that were pagans, and they worshipped many gods and goddesses. With Odin being, of course, the supreme deity, and Frigg, his wife, you will see that the structure of Nordic mythology is patriarchal in nature, but women have a very important place in this. We're going to get back to that. Now, if you look at the Nordic pantheon, you will notice that it's highly similar to the Greeks. The Greeks that I already made a video on, it's also in the description. And that's explained very easily by the fact that both of these beliefs stem from the Indo-European system of belief of mythology. So they have a common ancestor, as one would expect. But, and I say but, it's Indo-European, so you shouldn't be surprised. Indians also have a similar system, Hinduism, with their many gods, and it's so interesting to see the correlation between the gods, because it's essentially the same thing, with a slight difference here and there. It's the same systems, and surprise, surprise, the three cultures are highly masculine. They put a lot of emphasis on strength, because if you look at the gods, what are the gods? The gods are idealized version of men that men should aspire to become. And the gods of these religions are all extremely strong and all depicted as highly muscular, which is right up my alley, because this is what I like. This is why I like the lifting culture of these nations, and why Viking lifting culture, again to this day, is extremely attractive to men. And if you look at the systems and paganism in general and monotheism, you'll also notice that the gods of these religions are much closer to us than in monotheist religions. If you believe in Christianity, there is a distance between you and God. You are not like God. If you believe in Islam and Allah, Allah is unique. He is the one. He has nothing that compares to his greatness on this earth. You cannot understand what Allah thinks at any time, because he is a completely different being. He is not a human being. The gods of the Nordic religion pretty much appear like very strong humans. They appear like overpowered humans, and they all possess human emotions, which also means that they interfere with earthly life. Just like within Greek mythology, where Zeus would just drop by and grab a few chicks and carry them home to fuck, it's the exact same thing in this particular scenario. And this, of course, makes it much easier for men to relate, right? It's a form of cult that men can relate to, because it gives them role models to look up to. Because Nord gods were essentially chads by our own standards, and there are a ton of examples of that. My favorite one is Tyr, which I know I'm mispronouncing, who sacrificed his arm against the giant wolf Fenrir, and was known for wielding a giant sword with only one arm. You also have someone like Vidar, who was called the silent god, so that by itself is cool enough. As for Tyr, he can be regarded as the god of war, and warriors used to pray to him before they would enter battle. And I actually have one such prayer that I'm going to read to you right now. You must know victory runes if you want to know victory. Carve them into your sword's hilt on the blade guards and the blade, invoking Tyr's name twice. So it was a form of ritual where you would, in a sense, invoke the presence of Tyr by making his weapon, your weapon his, and then going to fight by invoking his name. Then you also have the aforementioned Vidar, who was one of the few gods to survive Ragnarok, which is the end of times, and who killed the giant wolf Fenrir with a sword, so a blow to the chest, and then, just for extra measure, he tore his jaw apart. The way it's described, he pretty much did this. Took both sides of Fern's jaw and just did this. And one side just flew and the other side ended up in his hand. Which is very fitting because he was the god of revenge and he was taking revenge for the death of, I think it was another god who died by Fenrir's action, and he was taking revenge for that. So when you look at gods of that caliber, what they looked like, what they did, their pastimes, and their characteristics, you wonder what type of heaven the Vikings believed in. And it's actually quite famous because I'm sure that you've heard the name Valhalla. Valhalla is the place where you go as a Viking, where you die. But not everyone is welcome in Valhalla. The only people that actually can step foot in it are people who died on the battlefield. That is the only time. If you die in any other scenario, you're going to go to the underworld, which is not hell, right? It's not the Christian hell. It's just a place where you go when you're dead. It's not a bad place. It depends on what you did in life. But heaven was reserved for warriors. And if you were one of the chosen few, you would be feasting alongside Odin for the rest of times. You would also be wrestling each and every single day. So even in death, you keep fighting. That tells you a lot about Vikings, that their best reward in their heads would be that. If you look at the Muslim paradise, you would see that there is going to be streams of milk, there is going to be honey, there is going to be luxuries all around. Same for the Christian heaven, that is all, in a sense, focused on a payback for your life on earth. If you did good things, you're going to have good things. In the Nord heaven, it doesn't work like that. And on top of it, it's not infinite, meaning that you will eventually go back to fight, because at some point there will be the Ragnarok, the end of time. And when the Ragnarok starts, Odin is going to grab all of the people that are in Valhalla and they're going to go fight. They're going to go fight the giant wolf, etc., etc. Which is interesting because it's highly selfish, right? It shows that Odin is only doing that so it has to have the best warriors with him when it's time to actually go fight again. So it's a form of selfishness that the Vikings apparently accept in their deity, which is interesting because it shows that Viking deities had weaknesses, they had character flaws. Just like in Greek mythology, not all of the gods were good people, and even the good ones, quote-unquote good ones, had things with them that were wrong, which is why it's also so easy to relate to them directly. Now, I always like to look at cultures and the thing that they believe to be paradise, because it tells you a lot about people, right? If you believe in a form of afterlife, the conditions to enter that afterlife is going to dictate the way you live your life. So for example, if you're a Christian, most likely, if you believe in heaven, you believe that you must be a good person to go in heaven. So you're going to try and emulate that in everyday life. You're going to live as Jesus would live himself. That is for one type of morality. And then you have Valhalla. Who enters in Valhalla? The people who fight. So what norms and values is it going to impress on the average Viking of the time? Well, it's quite simple. It's going to encourage them to fight. Because the only way to enter Valhalla is to die on the battlefield. So now you understand why these people had a warrior culture. Men were constantly encouraged to fight and conquer. And violence, under the form of courage, was therefore deemed moral and good. And that explains their domination of Europe. They dominated Europe for almost 300 years. When you have an entire social structure that is tailored towards encouraging men to conquer, you cannot be surprised that you're going to be extremely successful. It's the same with Islam. The Islamic conquest was so great because their religion is also tailored towards that. I would argue that within monotheist religions, the one that comes the closest to a warrior culture is Islam. And that, of course, comes with other things that one could consider bad. For example, the fact that Vikings were partly responsible for the boom of slavery, which also makes them very alike Muslims. I think it's the reason why they got along so well with Muslim merchants of the time, is because both cultures were actively practicing slavery. And at the time, 15% of Western Europe was enslaved. That's in 1950. That's in year 1000. So in 1950, that's a lot of people. That's millions of people. And that is what happened. What happens, of course, with a warrior culture. It creates deaths. It creates slaves. And this is why Vikings produced some of the most prolific conquerors in history. I can cite a few of them, like for example, Thorkel the Tall, which anyone who has watched Vinland Saga knows about. Yes, he is a real person. You also have Erik the Red, or Egil Skallagrimson, was a warrior poet who killed his first man by age 7 and wrote his first poem by age 3. So as you can tell, strong culture, strong men, but also dire consequences for the people who have to deal with them. But this does not mean that Vikings were evil or that Muslims were evil. It just means that their moral values clash with that of today. They had a moral stand and a moral stance that was just in line with who they were as a people. And if you are a Christian like I am, born Christian at least, you should do the work to be able to look beyond your Christian paradigm and understand that there are going to be people who are not going to follow that. I also want to point out the fact that the church actually won. In the end, because those monks that were so mad at Vikings for raiding their monasteries eventually got their way, because the Vikings were Christianized, they became Christian, and with that, slavery also disappeared because slavery was frowned upon by Christianity at the time. So just to explain the power that courts and morality have, meaning that it actually civilized Vikings to the point that at some point they were so domesticated that they disappeared, because the morality of their culture that gave them their strength also disappeared as well. But that is for back then. Now, if we look at our perspective, what can we do with that Viking culture? Is it still in line with us and our values? Well, something clashes, but I still believe that there are values that us modern men can learn from, because they are all in line with what I and most people would consider positive masculinity, positive with quotation marks, of course, because even the negative parts of masculinity are part of masculinity and just as important. And that is seen in the myths I already explained to you, right? This is again the reason why so many men feel kinship towards the Viking culture. But I also want to point out that beyond mythology, Old Norse philosophy also emphasized the importance of loyalty, modesty, and compassion. The only thing is that these values were only secondary to self-reliance. So in Viking culture, strength was above all, and then the rest came. So you could still be a good person, but they saw it as impossible to be a good person if you are weak. The loyalty of the weak is useless. The modesty of the weak is useless because, of course, you're modest and humble, you are garbage. The compassion of the weak is also useless. The weak has no ability to not be compassionate or nice. They are forced to do that. So this is why strength was important. It was paramount in the life of a man. You became a strong and independent man first, then you use that confidence to do what you right now would traditionally consider to be good. But this doesn't mean that Vikings were individualists. Even though they wanted the development of the self over anything else, you come to understand that what they truly wanted to achieve by that is a strong collective, because they believed that to have a strong group, you could only do so by having strong individuals. So they would first and foremost focus on the ability of the one to be strong, and then when the one became the many, it became even stronger. There are stories of 30 Vikings raiding a town with 500 soldiers and winning the battle because of their strategies, but also because they were superior in terms of individuality. And this is also shown by their social customs. One that I like particularly, and I'm going to explain to you right now, is the fishing boat test. So if you wanted to fish on a boat, we're not talking about participating in a raid here, we're just talking about being able to set foot on a boat that Vikings were going to use and take to go fishing. you had to lift stones. And now we get back to what Vikings used to lift, because yes, they did used to lift things which were mostly natural stones found in the wild. In Iceland, these were called the driftic stones, and they ranged from 50 pounds, so 20 kilos roughly, to 340 pounds, 160 kilos. And for those of you that are going to tell me, oh, I can deadlift that, it's 3 plates. No. A natural stone is not a deadlift on the bar in your nice commercial gym, okay? It is much harder to lift. It is not made to be lifted at all, and this is the point. It is the point of the test. Now, if you look at these stones again, if you could lift the first stone, that was 100 pounds, you would qualify as useless. If you could lift the second stone, you would qualify as weakling. If you could lift the third stone, which was 200 pounds, you would be called half strong. And only the fourth stone, which again is 340 pounds, qualified you as full strong. So 50 pounds, you're useless, like you don't even exist, okay? 100 pounds, you're weakling, so they might allow you to wash the fish when they come back. 200 pounds, you're half strong, so maybe they'll let you on the boat just to wipe the floor. And then full strong, you're going to be a full part of the crew and a fisherman. That's 300 pounds. Do you understand that right now, if you go to your commercial gym, 90% of people won't be able to pick up the third stone. And the fourth stone at this point is a feat of strength that many will not even be able to attain in their life. This was the test to step on the fishing boat. I think now you understand better why they were so feared in terms of warfare. It's because these are the fishermen of the crew. And of course, the fishermen were also the fighters, but this is absolutely insane. And if you look at what it does in terms of society and norms, this essentially meant that to be able to get on the boat to fish, you had to be strong, which would make sure that you would catch plenty of fish and you would keep the other fishermen safe. But it also meant that everyone weak enough and too weak instead to lift the stones could not earn a living. It's like if you showed up to work at McDonald's and they told you, okay, bench 500 pounds, and you're like, what? I can't. And they're like, okay, then fuck off. Like society as a whole refuses to let you earn a living unless you are strong. This sounds horrible, but you're going to see that there is a reason for that. The reason for that is because in Viking culture, a man needed to be able to provide for his family and protect them at all times. So society as a whole had to make sure that no one got to get those privileges before proving they were worth it. And how do you prove yourself as a man? Well, you go through rites of passage, which were very important to Vikings, and Viking men saw it as their duty to prepare their sons for manhood, because it was the most important task. Compared with today, where most men are not really men anymore. Most fathers know jack shit about being a man. They teach nothing to their sons if they even interact with their sons at all. And you understand why masculinity is almost lost. We also come to understand the importance of rites of passages. We don't have that anymore. It was entirely removed. The last one that we had was le service militaire, military service. Forced enrollment. For 2 years, you would learn how to be a soldier, how to be physically active, and how to obey orders. That was the last thing we had left as a rite of passage, and it is gone. Nowadays, you become a man when you're 18 or you learn how to drive a car. Look at what it produced. We have a society where most men are not men, they stay forever boys. This was something that Vikings tried to avoid as much as possible, because they did not believe you could just age into being a man. They actually had a social status reserved for men who never passed the rite of passage, but were of age, and these were not called men. They were not boys, they were not men, they were in between, and these people had no rights whatsoever. They would have a tough time earning a living, and they would of course not get a family. If you wanted to be a man, you had to survive 15 winters, which is not our winters. I mean, mine are fucked up. Yours might be nicer, but to survive a Viking winter, you had to be extremely tough. Then you had to learn how to ride a horse. These were the basic minimums to become a man. Then when that was acquired, you were also expected to possess a wide range of skills ranging from hunting, fishing, gathering, building, and repairing equipment. All traits that allowed you to not only be self-reliant, but also to provide for the group. So first and foremost, you had to become a strong individual, and then you were expected to use that strength to help the people around you. It's why I told you that Vikings were not individualists. They only believed that if you're going to be of use, you better be strong. It's like if you're going to build a machine and all of the cogs are shit and are going to break in 2 seconds. Do you think the machine is going to be strong? Absolutely not. So it's essential here in the fabric of Viking culture that every single fiber of the fabric is as strong as humanly possible. Which is why social bonds were seen as essential, because your potential as a man is only useful if you're useful to the group. And in Nordic philosophy, in Old Nord philosophy, the only way to reach one's potential was part of the group, which is why they valued again raids as groups, they did everything in communities, etc., etc. But if you could not do that, if you proved to be useless to the group, well, it was very simple. The society was going to reject you, or you were going to have a very low social status, because for men that never got to actually pass these rites of passage, they ended up never being able to marry or form a family. And that was very simple also. It's because women would reject you. You can't step onto a boat, so you can't earn money. You cannot colonize other lands, so you cannot increase your territory. You're not going to be able to provide for children. Even if you had children, you would be too weak to protect them. Why would a woman actually select you? This is good old toxic femininity, and it was needed. I could only pray that women would be as tough today, because if they did, men would have to start giving a fuck. If women started to actually discriminate openly on physical strength, ability to provide, etc., etc., most men would be left without anything, and that would be great. I'm certain that some of you that already struggle to get a girl, even with these low-ass standards they have nowadays, are quite pissed at me. But understand one thing, you have to be better. Vikings understood that as well, so they created an environment where men were pressured to be better, and that created very strong men in return. Which also created strong fathers. Because if the only people that can procreate are strong, guess what happens? They are going to themselves give strong values to their sons that are going to go on to become strong men, and just like that, you have a healthy and enduring society that is going to survive in time, which is why Norse society was vibrant and managed to spread itself for so long. And this also means that marriage and family were at the core of Viking civilization, with men having, of course, most of the decisional power, qualifying them as a patriarchal society. Nowadays, it apparently is a bad thing, but you come to understand that this system was popular with the vast majority of humanity for a reason. It's because it works. When you promote strong masculine values, not only is it good because it produces more strong men, but it also creates a society that is safer for women and for children because there are people to protect them. And Vikings understood that, which is why they were strictly enforcing the norms, strictly enforcing the rules. They absolutely wanted you to pull your weight. They wanted you to become the best man you could potentially be. Because that way, the system and society perpetuates itself, and it guarantees the survival of everyone that is involved in it. And yet, certain aspects of Viking society show that these systems were not as oppressive as one could think. Of course, you're going to believe that they would toss babies that were too weak off of cliffs, and if you can't be of use, you're just going to be tossed to the dogs. No, it's not how it worked. Instead, the way it functioned is that they valued strength to the point that if you could not be strong, they were not going to give you responsibilities because they thought you simply could not handle it. They did everything in their power to create strong men, which is why they had these guidelines and these things to follow. And if you couldn't do that, well, you were simply not going to be given access to women because it was seen as impossible for you to protect them. So this is why I just told you. The patriarchy was created as a way to, yes, protect society, yes, promote men, but it was always also for the benefit of people who were not men. And if you take one look at our modern society, in Western countries, for example, you quickly understand that the death of masculinity is not only damaging for men, it's also damaging for women because there is no one to protect them anymore. So they are going to suffer from that as well. Same for children. Now, of course, Viking society was not an egalitarian society at all. As Vikings openly practiced slavery, the men had more rights and more power, and they were even known for doing certain things that are quite horrendous by our standards. Like, for example, when a master died, the servants would be burned alongside with the corpse of the master because they were seen as his possession. And because they burned the rest of his possession, they also burned the servants. So they had absolutely no issues treating humans as possession. They didn't necessarily go out of their way to persecute the weak. We know that people with a handicap, for example, still had their place within Viking society, but because the Viking system was meritocratic in nature, it essentially meant that freedom had to be earned, and the only way to be free was to be strong. So if you're not strong enough to earn your rights with your own hands, then you had no rights. It's simply the way the system functioned. Now, of course, to this day, for us who are democratic and we live in a system of equality, all of that sounds quite horrendous because everyone should be given the same rights, even if they did absolutely nothing to earn them. But back then, it was la loi du plus fort, right? Might makes right, as they say. But interestingly enough, once you actually possessed that strength and the independence that go with it, you are free to do as you pleased. So, for example, there are cases of women who were fighting alongside the men. They were called the child maidens, and there was no problem with that. The men were not sending them back in the kitchen because these women could kill them. So you have cases of women who were buried in warrior burial sites because they fought just as well as the men. Now, of course, unlike what some people would like you to think, they were much lower in terms of proportion due to simple biology. Because if you're going to send your bigger and stronger to battle, you're going to send the men. That makes sense. But even if you are not going to fight on the battlefield and you are just a stay-at-home mom in the Viking world, you would still actually be much more badass than the average modern female because they were far from weak. We have plenty of writings that show that, which also goes to show that even in a highly patriarchal society, women had their place. Some people even went as far as to say that Vikings were feminists. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but not in the terms that we understand today. They still wanted men and women to do different things, but they never restricted the liberty of someone who wanted to actually emancipate themselves from the restriction of the rules. The only thing you needed to possess to be able to do that is strength. So if someone whined and complained about being restricted, they would just ignore them because whining is for cowards and weaklings. But if a woman decided to say, you know what, fuck it, I'm not going to be a good wife, I'm going to grab a knife and I'm going to go fight, they were like, all right, no one is going to stop you from doing that. It is your life, it is your responsibility to do that. And this went actually quite far because the women's right, what we'd call women's right, were essentially women doing what they wanted, when they wanted, because they had the strength to do it, and no one was going to stop them from doing that. So if a man, for example, was mistreating his wife, it wasn't uncommon for the wife to just stab him. Because, of course, you're going to slap me, I'm going to stab you. I read some stories that showed how far Viking women were going to go. There was one in particular where a Viking man slapped his wife for a bad reason. There was no explanation. There was an explanation, but it was because she did something he didn't like. And 2 years afterwards, he was fighting off invaders and she was fighting alongside him, and he reached for a bow because he was being overrun by the attackers, and the wife had the bow and she looked at him and she said, remember what you did 2 years ago? The slap? Yeah, go fuck yourself. And the guy died and she survived and she took another husband. This is equality. Right? It's equal rights, equal lefts. The ability to fight is what earns you rights and not the ability to whine and complain that you don't have rights. So this was essentially what women were like back then. And it wasn't limited to just the relationship with the men. When the guys were out at sea to fight, it was actually the women who took over and were in power. They took care of everything. Now, of course, they were barred from political power because political power was reserved for the warriors, but so were weak men. So it was really only a question of the ability to fight and how high your social status was. Now, of course, it's sexist because females lacked the biological power and imperative to actually earn their place within the political sphere. So that's receivable. But Vikings decided that it was best if men took the decisions. But it doesn't mean that all of the decisions were taken by the men, because most of the finances were handled by women back then. Family finances were usually the duty of the woman in charge. She was the queen of the home. This was her domain. And if you look at old stories, the role that women serve is usually one of inciters, which they tend to serve in patriarchal cultures and societies. By inciters, what I mean is that they would goad the man to do certain things. Like, for example, if a husband was lazy and didn't want to go on a raid, the woman would be the one at night to be like, hey, you should really go on that raid. You should prove yourself as a man. You know, she would say these words to him to motivate him and enrage him and make himself more masculine, more vigorous, so that he would want to go out, he would want to conquer. This was also the role of women. It was also quite common for a woman to force their man to go out and enact vengeance against someone that wronged them. So someone, for example, I don't know, was mean to them or spat on them, and the woman would go to the man and be like, he did this to me, and if you're my man, you better go and kill him, because I'm not going to stand for that dishonor. This was mostly what they would do. So you see that the role that they had was more in the shadows. They were not the ones fighting, but if you think about it for a second, why would a Viking man go out there and earn riches? For his own sake? I mean, they loved jewelry, they loved to braid their beards, but it wasn't gangsta rap. The guy wasn't going to stack cash in his house and film TikToks with it. It was all for the family. And who handled the family finances? The women. So even though they did not do the fighting, they still benefited greatly from the riches that came from the fighting. And the family's honor was actually extremely important to women, which interestingly is also a common trait that is found amongst most patriarchal society, where it looks and appears like women don't have a say in the matter, but when you look into it for a second or two, if you look at Italians, even to this day, if you look at Latinos, yes, the men are in charge, yes, there is machismo in the house, but if you know the family structure, you know who is actually pulling the string. It usually tends to be the mom, it tends to be the grandmom, it tends to be the figure behind the man. And it was the exact same thing in Viking culture. And this also meant that for the creation of strong warrior and strong men that would be able to perpetuate that system, it was quite common for women with their young kids, their young boys, that they would encourage them to be more masculine, what we would call nowadays toxically masculine. They would want their boys to be tough, they would push them to fight, to be better, etc., to develop the skills to become a man, because they perfectly understood that this served them as much as it served the man. This meant that by having strong men, there was a bigger protective force for them, for their future kids, more riches and resources coming in, so more ability to have bigger and stronger families. And therefore, it benefited everyone equally. Now, if we're going to look at laws, I also found very interesting the fact that there were plenty of them put in place to protect women from unwanted attention. And any transgression was brutally punished. It goes as far as being much worse than what we do nowadays. If you raped a woman back then, you weren't just going to be sent to jail. Something really bad was going to happen to you. And of course, most crimes were punished much more severely, like theft, for example. But it goes to show that the place of women was also one of privilege. And if you look at Nordic sagas as well, the way women were depicted was always as very beautiful and wise. And this is because wisdom was a very important quality in Viking society. It wasn't just strength. Just being strong wasn't enough. You need to have both. It's why at the start I told you that the image we have of Vikings is very one-dimensional. We see them as brutish, and this is what they wanted. They wanted to be perceived as such. But underneath that is a wealth of wisdom. According to Nord philosophy, for example, wealth is temporary, but wisdom is eternal. It's strange coming from people who would raid others to steal their riches, but again, understand why they did that. It was to bring it home to the family so as to grow, so as to travel to other lands, so as to conquer more territory and to expand. It was all for the sake of expansion. It did not mean that they lacked wisdom or that they were materialistic, quite the opposite. And actually, even their travels, that one could see as just, again, another way to further their power, was also in the quest of wisdom, because Nordic philosophy encouraged travels because you could only learn wisdom by experience, and since you could only earn independence through wisdom, Viking men had to leave. They had to leave their lands. It wasn't just about the riches or to get a family or to get a wife. It was because if you failed to do that, you would be wisdomless and therefore you would never become truly independent. And in Viking wisdom is also inscribed the fatalistic nature of this world and of this existence. They believe that everything was predetermined and that no one can actually escape their fate. But if you look at the lives that they led and the values that they had, none of that was negative. It wasn't a pessimistic culture, it was quite the opposite. They were highly optimistic and they appreciated and accepted every single aspect of life. And that is because they encouraged to live life full of courage and full of fortitude, which proves, by the way, that determinism doesn't necessarily lead to weak men, as long as the values associated with what makes a good existence are sane and healthy. Islam is the same. Allah predetermines everything. He has decided your destiny for you. He already knows everything. Does it mean that you're just going to lay there and do nothing or be a bad person? No. You're going to do your best. This is what accepting fate is. It's accepting that you might not be fully in control, but you're going to do everything in your power to live as good of a life as possible. This was also the model for Viking. This was also the reason why, as I said, some Vikings back then converted to Islam. It was because the religions, even though one believed in only one God and the other one in a plethora of them, were extremely close in terms of values. And this is why, to this day, paganism is extremely attractive to the modern man. It's because it propagated positive values that could uphold the structures that keep society alive, as I already explained. Which is why people nowadays who don't have a cult, who might have been born Christian but there's not really a Christian faith where they live, look up to that. They look up to that culture or religion that has nothing to do with them in terms of DNA, but in terms of value, it is close to what their heart actually desires. It's not necessarily the cause that they yearn for, but the return to strong masculine values that would give reason and value to their lives. Viking men knew exactly what their life was about and where they stood, because they had men before them to tell them, and the entirety of society was built around their ability to succeed. If they fucked up, society collapsed. Nowadays, if you disappear tomorrow, do you think society is going to change? Many of you would say no, and you are correct. You could die tomorrow and no one would notice, save for your close family, because the wood does not rest on your shoulders. A Viking knew that if he died, his family would suffer, his community would suffer, his people would suffer. He did not have the right to do that. This is what carried him forward. These are the strong values that are needed for men nowadays. And this was also widely promoted by Nord spirituality. Because if you are surrounded by men who are also very masculine, and on top of that, your paganism, your form of religion, provides you with a plethora of male power fantasies in the form of all of the gods I cited already, you are going to naturally model your behavior after that. Which explains why, to this day, we have feats of strength coming from men that were born Viking that are still out of this world. I would like to cite, to conclude this video, the legendary Usopor stone that's 400 pounds that was apparently used by shepherds to prevent the sheep from escaping. Shepherds. They would pick a 400-pound stone and they would run laps around the pen to prove their strength as a game. Likewise, we have the Latra stones that were rocks that fishermen would pick up on their downtime to earn bragging rights. They would pick up hundreds of pounds just to flex in front of their bodies. You know what this means? It means that strength was an integral part of society and that being strong earned you respect. If you wanted other men to look at you in a positive light, if you wanted to be able to find a wife, you needed to be strong. The only way to reach a higher social status was to be strong. The only way to own land was to be strong. The only way to pass down your genes was to be strong. There was no way around it. And this made it so that men were, surprise, surprise, strong. Whereas if you look at us today and our modern Western culture, we still have structures, We're not without structures, we're just as structured as the Nords, we have just as much of a morality as the Vikings, but look at what it did to us instead. Our values don't encourage strength, they encourage weakness. We have a weak morality that leads to weak people. And the people that live under that system absolutely hate it. It's why everyone tries to deconstruct nowadays. They try to tear down the system because they think that's how they're going to reach happiness. But is it really the case? We have started nowadays to equate the absence of norms and restrictions with freedom, without realizing that rules are also guides. And this is where Viking understood something that we forgot. They understood the importance of rules, they understood the importance of systems and structures, and they made sure to live up to them, which in return produced strong individuals, which also created strong societies that tend to be healthy societies for everyone involved. A weak society, as egalitarian as it might be, is only going to produce equalitarian misery. It's only going to produce people who are all going to be the same, sure, but they're all going to be the same because they're all going to be miserable in the exact same fashion. Nowadays, the rules that we follow are disconnected from their roots, they are senseless and destructive, but instead of trying to get rid of them, or turning into Vikings, because I'm not advocating for becoming Vikings again, this is not the point of this video. What I would want instead, and this is the message of this series in particular, is for us to look at our past and try to understand where we went wrong so as to reclaim some of the wisdom of the ancients. Something that I hope I was able to do with this Viking lifting wisdom, where I impressed upon you the values of those people of the past that we look up to for a reason. It's because they possess something that we have lost, something that is still in our power to reclaim, as long as we are able to decipher between what is going to be positive values for us and what is going to be destructive, negative values that are just going to make us weaker. Always turn towards things that are going to promote your own strength, because this is also where virtue tends to lay. And I'm going to leave you with that. I'm going to be making more videos about lifting wisdom from all types of cultures. I hope that this one was fun to watch, and I'm going to catch you very soon.